The year 1957. A thin sheet of parchment landed on a Genevan antique dealer's desk. Faded ink, brittle edges, intricate Latin script. It depicted the world as it was known in the mid-15th century. But to the west, beyond Greenland, an island was clearly drawn, an island that simply couldn't have existed on maps of that era. The inscription read, Vinlanda Insula, Vinland Island, dated to approximately 1440, half a century before Columbus. This parchment wasn't just a map. It was a piece of evidence, a stunning challenge to the entire history of the Age of Discovery. This discovery forced historians to re-evaluate a central question. Were the Norse sagas of a land across the ocean merely folklore, or were they the meticulous log of the Middle Ages' most audacious voyage? At that moment, the case of the Viking Code was reopened, the close of the 10th century. For 99% of Europe's inhabitants, the world was small, confined, and terrifying. Its boundaries were defined not by geography, but by fear. The Atlantic Ocean wasn't a body of water. It was the sea of darkness, the final frontier beyond which lay the domains of monsters and an abyss leading straight to hell. Maps of the era weren't navigational tools, but rather theological treatises, with Jerusalem at the center of everything and dragons populating unknown lands. Seafaring was strictly coastal, hugging the shoreline from cape to cape, always keeping land in sight. To lose sight of the shore was to lose oneself. Yet to the north, on the icy fringe of civilization, a culture thrived for whom the sea was not a barrier, but a highway. The Norse. They were driven from their homelands by a scarcity of arable land and brutal internal strife. Their longships, sitting low in the water, swift and nimble, were the perfect instruments of expansion. They had already colonized Iceland, a feat unimaginable for the rest of Europe. They did not fear the open water. They had learned to read its signs, the flight of birds, the color of the clouds, the behavior of whales. In the 980s, the exiled Eric the Red made the next leap into the unknown, establishing a settlement in Greenland. This was no promised land. It was an outpost at the edge of the world, clinging to life on a narrow strip of green amidst eternal ice. Connection to the wider world was tenuous and irregular. For the Greenlandic colonists, the future looked grim. They had reached their limit. Beyond lay only icy desolation. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that a new legend was born. A sailor named Bjarni Herjolfsson, having drifted off course en route to Greenland, spotted an unknown land to the west. A land covered in forests, flat and green. He did not disembark, eager to reach his destination, but his tale became the seed that fell onto fertile ground. Forests. In Greenland, where every log was a treasure, that word sounded like a promise of paradise. Eric the Red's son, Leif, listened to these accounts. He stood on the fjord's shore, gazing westward toward where the cold sun dipped below the horizon. Behind him was a colony teetering on the brink of survival. Ahead, an ocean the maps ignored, and the single account of one man. The old world, with its fears and its boundaries, was living out its final hours. The decision was all but made. Around the year 1000 CE, Leif Erikson made his first move. He didn't build a new ship. He didn't assemble an armada. He found Bjarni Herjolfsson and bought his Nar, the very vessel that had glimpsed the unknown shore. This act wasn't merely a transaction, it was a passing of the torch. Leif assembled a crew, 35 souls, the most seasoned and desperate seafarers in Greenland. Their objective was simple and audacious: to retrace Bjarni's route in reverse and set foot on the land he had only seen from afar. Recreating this voyage means imagining a journey navigated entirely by instinct. They had no maps, no compass. Their only guides were Bjarni's verbal account, the sun, the stars, and an incredibly deep, intuitive grasp of the ocean. The Nar pushed off from the dock in Eiriksfjörður and sailed westward. Days blurred into a monotonous grey procession, Water, sky, mist. Icebergs drifted silently past, like fragments of another world. The paramount question that would have occurred to any of their contemporary mariners would have sounded like a death sentence. How in the world did they know where they were going? How could they possibly maintain their course in that boundless chaos? The first land they found was a disappointment. A barren, rocky coastline shrouded in glaciers. Leif named it Helluland, the land of flat stones. This was not the land from the tales. Here, there was no life, no future. They didn't linger. The ship returned to the sea, heading south along the unseen coast. Their second stop was Markland, the forest land. Here they found precisely what they had sailed for. Endless forests, a source of timber that could save the Greenlandic colony. The mission, it seemed, was accomplished. Any pragmatist would have turned back, their holds brimming with precious wood. But Leif Erikson pressed on. This moment transformed the expedition from a resource-gathering mission into one of pure exploration. He was searching for something more profound, and he found it. After several more days of travel, they entered a tranquil bay. The climate here was noticeably milder than in Greenland. Rivers teemed with salmon, larger than any they had ever encountered. Lush grass grew in the meadows. And most importantly, in the forests, they discovered wild grapes. This detail so astonished them that Leif named the land Vinland, the wine land. They built a temporary encampment, several longhouses to overwinter. They didn't just land, they established the first European settlement in the New World. This was no ordinary event. The moment the first Viking axe bit into an American tree, a tectonic shift occurred in human history. A shift the world itself would only recognize 1,000 years later. The following spring, Leif Erikson returned to Greenland. His Nar sat low in the water, its holds laden not with stories, but with proof. Logs of valuable timber and dried clusters of wild grapes. For a colony where wood was more precious than iron, this was tantamount to striking gold. The reaction in Eriksfjörður was not one of shock at a geographical upheaval, but rather of purely pragmatic elation. They hadn't discovered a new continent, they had found a resource base. News of Vinland began its slow journey. It passed by word of mouth at the Althings in Iceland. Merchants recounted it in Norwegian ports. It didn't become a sensation. For a Norse world accustomed to expansion, it was just another tale of another land to the west, distant, dangerous, and potentially profitable. In the ensuing years, new expeditions were launched. Leif's brother Thorvald would die there from a native's arrow, and the merchant Thorfinn Karlsefni would attempt the most ambitious colonization effort, which would ultimately fail due to conflicts with the indigenous population, whom the Vikings called Skraelings. Beyond the Norse world, silence reigned. For the rest of Europe, whose intellectual heart resided in monastic scriptoria and the papal curia, these tidings were merely noise. Even if a rumor somehow reached a Hanseatic port, what would a learned monk or a Venetian cartographer have heard? The tale of an illiterate pagan sailor about a wineland beyond the Sea of Darkness. It would have sounded less like a geographical report and more like a myth, just another barbaric saga of enchanted islands. The historical dogma was impenetrable. The established model of the world, sanctioned by the authority of the Church and ancient sages, simply didn't account for any continents between Europe and Asia. To acknowledge Vinland's existence would have meant questioning the entire worldview. It was simpler to disregard the source. The system resisted, rejecting information that didn't fit its paradigm. Ptolemy's authority carried more weight than the testimony of 100 northern seafarers. This very lack of understanding created the perfect conditions for the secret's preservation. Knowledge of Vinland wasn't lost because no one was looking for it. It wasn't disputed, it wasn't classified. It was simply not taken seriously. It remained the domain of a small group of people on the fringes of the world, gradually transforming from actionable intelligence into folklore. This allowed it to survive in the sagas, like an insect in amber, untouched, yet invisible to everyone else. The knowledge didn't vanish. It was merely archived. How did they manage it? For centuries, the answer boiled down to a single phrase: dumb luck. Official science claimed that the Vikings, like blind kittens, simply stumbled across the ocean, hugging coastlines, orienting themselves by birds and hoping for clear weather. This version is convenient, but it doesn't withstand scrutiny. Multiple purposeful voyages between Greenland and America cannot be a series of accidents. There was a system behind them. The Vikings possessed a weapon unavailable to the rest of Europe, and it consisted of three components. The first component was hardware, their ship, the Nar. This was no mere boat, but a masterpiece of 10th century engineering. Its flexible, clinker-built hull breathed with the waves rather than fighting them. A single square sail allowed for efficient use of a following wind, and its broad deck could accommodate ample provisions and people. Its shallow draft made it possible to navigate into shallow bays and rivers. The Nar was the ideal tool for the transoceanic leap, reliable, fast, and autonomous. The second component was software, oral maps. The saga of the Greenlanders and Eric the Red's saga are not pure folklore. They are navigational protocols encoded in narrative form. They contain precise instructions. Sail west from this cape for 2 days. Stay south of the ice fields. Descriptions of coastal currents, characteristic weather phenomena, and even the migration patterns of whales. This information was passed down through generations, evolving into a collective mental map of the North Atlantic. Every skipper carried an entire library of routes and landmarks in their head. But the third, technological component was key, an element that transformed guesswork into certainty. The sagas mention a solarstein, a sunstone. For a long time, this was considered a poetic metaphor. Today, we know it referred to a crystal of Icelandic spar. This mineral possesses the property of birefringence and acts as a polarizing filter. Imagine a device that allows you to see the invisible, the direction of the sun's rays. A reconstruction of its use looks like this. On an overcast day, when the sun was completely hidden behind clouds, the navigator would take out the crystal. He would hold it up to the sky and rotate it. Polarized light passing through the crystal created a specific pattern. The moment the pattern became clearest or most symmetrical, the stone indicated the precise position of the hidden sun with an error of only a few degrees. It was a compass before the age of the compass, a tool that provided a decisive advantage in latitudes where fog and cloud cover are the norm, not the exception. The ship, the oral map, and the sunstone. This trinity constituted the Viking navigational system. It was invisible to outsiders. It had no written documentation, blueprints, or complex instruments. Their adversaries had no antidote because they weren't even aware of the weapon's existence. They saw only barbarians in primitive vessels, not realizing they were facing the representatives of the most advanced maritime culture of their time. For several years, Vinland became a reality. The most ambitious colonization attempt was led by the Icelandic merchant Thorfinn Karlsefni. He arrived with 3 ships, 160 settlers, including women and livestock. This wasn't an expedition, it was an act of civilizational transfer. At first, it seemed the project would succeed. They established a rudimentary trade with local tribes, exchanging red cloth for furs. The dream of a new Greenland, rich and fertile, was almost tangible. But the fragile peace shattered. A single careless incident, a settler's bull broke loose and frightened the natives, escalated into a bloody skirmish. Trade gave way to war. Here, thousands of miles from home, the Vikings' military advantage, iron swords and axes, was nullified by the numerical superiority and intimate knowledge of the terrain possessed by the Skraelings. The settlement transformed into a besieged fortress. Instead of building a new life, they fought for survival. The logic of the numbers was merciless. Constant attacks, losses, psychological exhaustion. After 3 years, Thorfinn Karlsefni made the only possible decision: evacuation. The Vinland project was abandoned. The last longship departed the American shore, and for the next 500 years, the connection between the two worlds was severed. The knowledge of the discovery didn't vanish, but it receded, moving from the practical realm into the mythological. It became a saga, a tale of a heroic past recounted on long winter nights. The historical thread had broken. 9 centuries later, in the 20th century, history seemed to repeat itself, though this time as a rather elaborate scientific farce. The Vinland map, an artifact that had reignited the ancient mystery, was about to face its own perfect storm. After decades of debate, in 1974, a group of independent experts conducted a microscopic analysis of the ink. The verdict was unequivocal and crushing. The ink used to create the map contained anatase, a crystalline form of titanium dioxide. This was a substance that could only be manufactured on an industrial scale after 1920. The map, it turned out, was a forgery. A brilliant and intricate forgery, but a forgery nonetheless. For academia, this was the definitive end to the inquiry. The crucial piece of evidence that had rocked the world was a fake. Skeptics declared victory. The story of Vikings in America was once again relegated to the dusty shelves of folklore. It appeared the chapter was decisively shut. The declaration of the map's forgery seemed to be the definitive last word. But in science, much like in history, a closed case can be dramatically reopened by a single, unconventional hypothesis. While most historians debated the chemical composition of the ink, Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his wife, archaeologist Anna Steiner Ingstad, made a stroke of genius. They cleverly shifted the focus of the inquiry. Their logic was simple. The map may be a forgery, but what if the narrative it depicts is accurate? They chose to scrutinize not the artifact itself, but the foundational primary sources, the sagas. For centuries, the critical error of the skeptics had been to read the sagas purely as literature. The Ingstads, however, read them as a meticulous navigational log, a precise set of instructions. They posited that the geographic descriptions within the Saga of the Greenlanders, Helluland, Markland, Vinland, were not merely poetic imaginings, but precise geographic markers of actual locations. Armed with this groundbreaking hypothesis, they embarked on a methodical, years-long search. They systematically explored the coast of North America from Rhode Island to Labrador, diligently comparing every inlet and every promontory against the ancient texts. The pivotal breakthrough came in 1960. In the small fishing village of Lans aux Meadows, situated on the northernmost tip of Newfoundland, a local fisherman pointed the Ingstads towards several overgrown grassy mounds that had long been dismissed by residents as an ancient indigenous encampment. But their shape was subtly wrong. It was unmistakably Scandinavian. Helge Ingstad instantly recognized the telltale outlines of longhouses identical to those unearthed in Greenland and Iceland. The site perfectly matched the descriptions in the sagas: an ideal harbor, a salmon-rich river, and sprawling pastures for livestock. The dig commenced, and the earth itself began to speak. From beneath the sod emerged not merely foundations, but irrefutable evidence that defied forgery. A forge containing bog iron slag, a bronze cloak pin of unmistakably Norse craftsmanship, a spindle whorl for spinning wool, and iron rivets clearly used for ship repairs. These artifacts spoke volumes about their previous owners. The indigenous peoples of North America knew nothing of iron metallurgy, nor the advanced technology required for spinning sheep's wool. This was, unequivocally, a Viking encampment. The final, undeniable piece of the puzzle, however, came from radiocarbon dating. Analysis of charcoal from the hearths and samples of worked timber yielded dates ranging from 990 to 1030 Common Era. A precise bullseye. In that instant, the sagas transcended folklore, transforming into undeniable historical documentation. This revelation instantly snapped all the disparate details into a coherent picture. The Vikings' arsenal of ingenuity, their ships, their oral maps, their sunstones, was undeniably real. Section 5. Their voyages were no mere accident, but the result of systematic, sophisticated navigation. Section 3. The discovery at Lanceau Meadows was far more than just the uncovering of a settlement. It was tangible proof that validated the entire underlying logic of their expansion. The Vinland map, it turned out, was not the key itself, but rather a powerful catalyst that spurred the search in the correct location. The true Viking code was not deciphered in a sterile laboratory, but unearthed in the field, with a shovel in hand and the sagas as their guide. Now, with all the evidence laid bare, we can reconstruct the timeline. This is a story not of accidental discovery, but of systemic failure. It began, indeed, with an error. A storm blew Bjarni Herjolfsson's ship off course, and he sighted land he hadn't been seeking. But what followed was a chain of precise, calculated decisions. Leif Erikson was no reckless adventurer. He was a verifier. He methodically followed Bjarni's oral report, step by meticulous step, sketching a new world onto his mental map. His route, meticulously reconstructed from the sagas and archaeological findings, unfolds like this: from Greenland west to the first land, rocky and covered with glaciers. This is Helluland, modern-day Baffin Island. Then south, along a coast dense with forests. This is Markland, the coast of Labrador. And finally, further south, to a point where the climate softens and salmon teem in the rivers. This is the northern tip of Newfoundland, the place he would name Vinland. The camp he established there is known today as Lanceau Meadows. The navigational triumph was absolute. They found it, and they returned. The next phase was not exploration, but colonization. Thorfinn Karlsefni's expedition was meticulously planned. 3 ships, more than 150 people, livestock. They established a settlement at the very same location as Leif. The initial contact with the indigenous population was peaceful and commercial. The Vikings offered cloth, the Skraelings, furs. 2 worlds met for the very first time, attempting to forge a dialogue. But the cultural chasm was simply too vast. An incident involving a bull, vividly described in the saga, became the tragic catalyst. Misunderstanding escalated into fear, and fear into violence. An asymmetrical conflict erupted. The Vikings, clad in iron and armed with steel, were virtually invulnerable in open battle. But the Skraelings refused open confrontation. They employed tactics of ambush, leveraged their intimate knowledge of the terrain, and exploited their numerical superiority. The settlement swiftly transformed into a military outpost in hostile territory. The decision to withdraw was not an act of cowardice. It was a rigorous risk assessment protocol. The supply line stretching back to Greenland was perilously overextended. Losses mounted. The relentless tension wore down the inhabitants. Karlsefni realized that holding this outpost was untenable. The project was economically and demographically unsustainable. After 3 years, the colonists boarded their ships and departed forever. Their victory lay in reaching a new continent, their tragedy in their inability to remain. Thus was accomplished the greatest navigational feat of the Middle Ages, and thus the first chapter of European history in America closed, almost as soon as it had begun. Thorfinn Karlsefni did not bring everyone back. Graves remained on the shores of Vinland, one holding Thorvald, Leif Eriksson's brother, slain by an arrow. The expedition returned to Greenland with a rich cargo of furs and timber, but also with a heavy truth. The New World was neither empty nor defenseless. The dream of easy colonization shattered against unexpected resistance. A triumph of navigation morphed into a strategic defeat. For the Greenlandic colony, this failure was a delayed death sentence. Vinland had been their sole chance for expansion, their only potential source of resources capable of sustaining their fragile life on the edge of the glacier. Losing this opportunity, the colony found itself trapped in its icy isolation. Ties with Europe weakened, and the climate grew harsher. 4 centuries later, the Greenlandic Vikings would vanish without a trace. Their great discovery did not save them, and its failure perhaps accelerated their demise. For the indigenous peoples, it was a victory. They had successfully driven out the invaders with their iron skins and steel stings. They had defended their land, yet they could not know that they had repelled only the first, faint ripple. They could not fathom that 500 years later, other ships would follow these, bearing cannons, diseases, and an ideology of conquest. Their successful defense in the 11th century merely postponed the catastrophe that would erupt in the 16th. This first contact was not simply a skirmish, it was the overture to one of the greatest tragedies in human history. Yet, the most profound casualty laid upon the altar of this failure was knowledge itself. It wasn't destroyed, it was simply rendered insignificant. Practical information about a transatlantic route devolved into folklore, into a heroic saga spun by the fire on long winter nights. The greatest discovery of the era wasn't classified or hidden, but merely forgotten, deemed unnecessary. The Viking triumph was so premature that humanity couldn't properly absorb it. And for 5 centuries, the Atlantic Ocean once again became the Sea of Darkness, veiling an entire continent beneath its churning grey waters. And so, we return to the beginning, to that very sheet of parchment that landed on an antiquarian's desk in 1957. The Vinland map. It turned out to be a forgery. But what a stroke of genius. Genuine 15th century parchment bearing 20th century ink. This was no mere fake. It was an intricate intellectual deception. Today, knowing the full story, we view this artifact in a new light. It wasn't proof, it was a challenge. A lie that compelled the world to seek the real truth, and therein lies its paradoxical grandeur. The true legacy of this investigation is not the yellowed parchment, but the excavated foundations at Lanzo Meadows. Archaeology confirmed what the sagas had whispered for 1,000 years. The story of Vikings in America ceased to be a hypothesis and took its rightful place in history books. It does not diminish Columbus's achievement, but rather places it in its proper context. He was not the first. He was merely the next. He did not discover a new world, but merely reconnected 2 worlds whose link had been lost for 5 centuries. This story proves that the past is not a static monolith. It is constantly being rewritten, not with ink, but with an archaeologist's shovel and laboratory analysis. It serves as a stark reminder that entire chapters of human achievement can be forgotten, ignored, and even erased by dominant cultures, reduced to folklore and myth. But truth, material and irrefutable, possesses an astonishing resilience. Sooner or later, it finds its way to the surface. The Viking discovery was premature. Their technology was ahead of its time, but their social and political structure proved unable to sustain that achievement. They touched the future, but could not hold on to it. And as we gaze upon modern maps, so precise and definitive, only one chilling question remains. How many more Vinlands, forgotten discoveries, erased histories, and silenced triumphs lie hidden in plain sight, awaiting their own archaeologists who will dare to read an old tale as an instruction manual?